So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the second half of the second day of SciCon 2023. I'm pleased to see that so many people have found the opportunity to join us in room 3 for what I think will be a highly interesting conversation with 3 distinguished panelists. We've named this panel Conflict in a Time of Vigilantes. And my name is Raymond Andresen. I'm with the Norwegian Ministry of Defense, but I'm here in a private capacity, so don't arrest me for anything. But I'm proud and I'm a bit humble to share stage with the 3 distinguished panelists, Dr. Bilyana Lilly in the center, Dr. Margaret Smith, Maggie, and Dr. Lars Gjesvik, all of whom I will introduce further later on. Following the Russian invasion of Ukraine on February 24th, 2022, war coverage in mainstream media has largely concentrated on the kinetic aspects of the conflict, showing us the tremendous suffering of the Ukrainian people. However, in a cyber context, the focus was initially on the lack of a Russian cyber shock and awe campaign in the early phases of the war. And further on, in the continuation of the conflict, within the cybersecurity community, a focus on the surprisingly ineffectiveness of Russian offensive cyber operations. During his opening remarks yesterday, the President of Estonia, His Excellency President Karis, reaffirmed Estonia's declaration that international humanitarian law applies to state activities in cyberspace. However, he also noted that we should now go further and, I'm quoting, clarify how IHL applies when malicious cyber means are used in armed conflict. For instance, what constitutes a use of force in cyberspace, and what is the status of civilians participating in armed conflicts? We will not answer all of the highly relevant questions of the President, but as we will see by the help of our 3 panelists, as a 5th domain in conflict, the full utilization of cyberspace in the war in Ukraine has highlighted the importance of cooperation with and contribution from private IT companies in order to meet new challenges. Furthermore, the utilization of the cyber domain and digital infrastructure plays a pivotal role in Ukraine's fight for their sovereignty. And as such, when planning for the next conflict, control of digital infrastructure and digital sovereignty will surely be a prerequisite and of high importance for all states conducting their prudent planning. I'm going to give you some of the questions that I hope we will be able to touch upon during our conversation. How are states able to ensure digital sovereignty in a time of global dependency? And is it even possible? Is it realistic for states to control digital infrastructure, or is it only an option for the few rich and powerful states? In light of how time and space of conflicts have changed drastically and is continuing to change as digital cyber development continues with the introduction of emerging and disruptive technologies, are states taking necessary measures to meet the demands of interconnectivity of our society? And what measures should be taken in order to meet these challenges, both on a domestic level by states themselves and on an international level with the cooperation with and integration of private IT companies' services? Are IT companies cognizant of their role in today's conflicts, not only focusing on risk and opportunities, but also, if any, on their obligations? Today, we will hear how Ukraine is utilizing global connectivity and soliciting the help of private volunteers and citizens in third-party countries to conduct a resistance movement like nonviolent action against Russia. We will also get a presentation on how private IT companies are helping to defend Ukraine and how these actors are sharing the stage with states in shaping new conflicts, offering important government and military capacity multipliers. Finally, we will see how awareness on digital dependencies and digital infrastructure, including the utilization of capabilities provided by private companies, are of highly importance when building digital resilience. We will try to identify steps that can be taken in order to map and address different forms of dependencies that might require contradictory policies from different states, potentially in close coordination with investments by global IT companies. All of the panelists will have 15 minutes available to give us an introduction of their research and provide us with a deeper understanding of today's topic. After the presentation from our talented panelists, we will continue with a conversation on stage, where at the end we will open for a couple of questions from the audience. Please stand up during your question and state your name and your affiliation. And without further ado, please allow me to introduce you to our first panelist. Dr. Margaret Smith is a U.S. Army cyber officer. She is also a faculty member and a researcher at the University of Maryland in College Park, Maryland. And her research interests include the intersection of technology and political violence, military applications of cyber operations, and state behavior in cyberspace. Maggie will introduce us to one of the more novelties and innovations of the war in Ukraine, also documented in her research paper, The Irregulars, Third-Party Cyber Actors and Digital Resistance Movements in the Ukraine Conflict, the IT Army of Ukraine. So Maggie, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Raymond. I appreciate it. And now I need to open my iPad, which is, there we go, worked out. So thank you so much for having me. And before I begin, I do have to give the disclaimer that everything that I say today is my own thoughts and ideas and do not represent the position of the United States government, the Department of Defense, or the United States Army. And with that, now I can begin. So on February 23rd, I found myself stuck in Denver. I was snowed in and I could not get out on a flight. And so I was sifting through some social media, figuring out like what was going on in the world. And I decided to open up the Flight Radar 24 app, which is an app that tracks flights all over the world. And so I looked at Denver and saw that no flights were going out. So because my flight had been canceled, there was no hope of me getting out until the next morning. And then I turned to Twitter and I started looking at what social media was saying. And there was a lot of discussion about Ukraine. So opened Flight Radar 24 again and moved it over to Ukraine. And I started looking at the flights that were going on around that conflict area, or the area that everyone felt was going to be a conflict zone. And I clicked on one, and it was a Rivet Joint, which is an exquisite intelligence collection platform of the United States military. And it was doing a sortie over the Black Sea. And it was flying in this beautiful kind of formation that was going out to Sochi and then coming back around, flying up to Odessa, and then back over to Turkey, and then going back. And I clicked on some others, and I saw some other U.S. assets flying around in interesting areas in Poland, doing some circling, in Moldova. And I was like, wow, there's a lot of U.S. activity going on in here. But what was most interesting is when I turned my attention back to Homer 61, which is the call sign of the Rivet Joint that I was following, I saw another aircraft take off from Sochi, and it was the Russian equivalent of a Rivet Joint, and one that they were projecting, or at least intelligence had projected that, or reporting had projected, was going to be the platform that they were going to add a lot of exquisite intelligence collection assets to. And that looked as though it was in response to the Rivet Joint flying over the Black Sea. So I was noticing all of this fantastic activity going on in open source that I could just access as a passive observer. And it really highlighted to me when the conflict actually kicked off 2 days later that this was going to be a very different type of war where different assets were going to be at play. And there was going to be a different dynamic that I was going to be able to observe thousands of miles away playing out in this geographically bound area of Ukraine. And so that got me interested in understanding and looking at the digital layout of the players that were having an impact on the conflict, both inside the confines of the geographic country of Ukraine, but also outside and external to that conflict. And that's where I enlisted the help of my colleague, Tom Dean, who's here with us today too. And we decided that we were going to investigate the IT Army of Ukraine. So what is the IT Army of Ukraine? So on February 26th, so 2 days after the conflict began or the invasion happened, Mikhailo Fedorov, the Ukrainian Deputy Prime Minister for Digital Transformation, on his public Telegram channel announced the creation of the Ukraine IT Army. And this was going to be a group of citizen volunteers that could help and aid and assist in Ukrainian resistance to the Russian invasion. And what transpired was this amazing kind of outpouring of support in the digital space for the Ukraine IT Army. And their membership within this Telegram channel that remains public has hovered around 200K followers, so about 200,000 followers, for almost the duration of how long they've been in existence, since February 26th. And so it's a fantastic community that is very focused on a mission set that is also having an impact, however small or however insignificant. As we heard yesterday, there's questions about how much of an impact they're having on the actual conflict. But when you look at it as a community or an ecosystem of a group of volunteers that are geographically dispersed around the globe, that are focused on a singular conflict and a singular purpose, which is disrupting Russian everyday day-to-day life, or like how you go about your regular day-to-day duties as a Russian citizen. It's a really fascinating ecosystem or community to investigate. So the way that we framed our understanding was through U.S. military doctrine, and specifically looking at the Irregular Warfare Annex and their description of resistance movements. So we define in the U.S. A resistance movement as an organized effort by some portion of the civil population of a country to resist either a legally established government or an occupying power, and to disrupt civil order and stability. So we took that frame, and then we also identified and relied on Zeynep Tufekci's definition of resistant activity. We used the term disruptive. So the IT Army is focused on disruptive activities. And then finally, we took an element from Tom Ridd's definition of how cyberspace, even offensive cyberspace operations, are disassociated from physical violence and are really not connected to this notion of violence as we think about it in conflict from kinetic activity. So we have this nonviolence resistance movement that is having an impact on the Russian occupiers, as we call them, or the invading army, in Russian territory, and having an impact on the day-to-day life of those citizens. So that's how we conceived of the IT Army, and through that reference of being a resistance movement as defined by military doctrine. And so what is fascinating from our perspective about the IT Army is the evolution of it over time. So as I mentioned, it was formed on February 26th, and so we dumped all of the data from February 26th until November 1st. And Telegram is a really great app to do research on, because you can download, if it's a public Telegram channel, you can download all of the data. So you get all the chats, you get all of the imagery, you get all of the files that are included within that Telegram channel from the time that you dump it. And so Tom took all of that data, and he was able to sort it and make it into a usable format so that we could investigate it further. And so what we looked at and wanted to identify was how many domains or how many targets were listed. And then we looked at what types of images and what types of files were included. And then we also looked for some key terms, looking at tool updates or whether they were doing recruitment, and keyed in on those type of aspects. So what we found was that between February 26th and November 1st, the IT Army had a total of 840 posts. Those were distinct posts. And then that included roughly 9,500 domains, and of those, about 4,000 were unique domains. And then we also found that there were about 580 screenshots, and we called those battle damage assessments, which is a U.S. military term to identify, like, if I do a kinetic strike, I do a battle damage assessment to see whether that strike was impactful. And these images were primarily screenshots of like 404 errors or like a website being down. And those were included in posts that showed like, hey, you guys did a great job. Thank you for DDoSing this, because it showed that this Russian website was down for 2 hours, along with some encouragement about it. So that allowed us then, we had an idea of how active this group was. And over time, they developed a nice pattern in many ways, or actually an observable pattern. So it went from being ad hoc, listing out maybe 30 targets for this IT army to go against, providing instructions for how to conduct a DDoS attack, providing tools or links to tools that average citizens could go to and use in order to have an impact on the specific targets that the IT army listed out. And they tended to do this in an ad hoc manner at the start. But then it got streamlined and it got consistent over time, where at about 9 o'clock on Eastern Standard Time, 9 o'clock Ukrainian time, so about 3 in the morning on Eastern Standard Time, they would list out the target list for the day, and then they would tell what time they wanted the IT army to execute. They would provide links and updates and recommendations for how to use the tools effectively to launch this DDoS attack. And then at the time and in the manner that was prescribed in the chat, they would execute on that action. And then they would provide, at the end of the day, a battle damage assessment saying, like, thank you guys, you did great. You know, you were successful. We took this website down from here. Another fascinating part of this community is that these BDA were really used as kind of this morale boost and a pump up message to say, like, look, you're having an impact. Thank you for your support. So what Tom and I decided to do is that we looked at Gene Sharp as a sociologist, and he really investigated nonviolent strategy and tactics. And this was all in the realm of resistance movements in the physical space. And so we applied the key aspects of nonviolent tactics and strategy to the IT army to look at it as a digital resistance movement. And the 7 key elements that we honed in on were, and I'll list them, but then I'll describe them, and so it'll be 7 in total. So the first one that we looked at was that Gene Sharp describes nonviolent tactics as taking an indirect approach. So you're looking at an opponent and you want to indirectly impact that opponent's power. And so what the IT army does is it has an impact on domestic life in Russia. It targets assets or services and public services within Russia that have an impact on the daily life of the average Russian. That is an indirect approach to getting at the Russian government, meaning that if life is uncomfortable for your citizens, then inevitably the Russian government is going to feel some of that pain because the citizens are not going to be happy. That's how we assessed it, and so from that perspective, Gene Sharp's key strategy and tactic of indirect approach applies here. The second one that Sharp calls out is the psychological elements, and I looked at this from 2 different perspectives. One is the psychological aspect of providing BDA for the internal community of the IT Army is a really important way that the IT Army the leadership seems to maintain the initiative and keep people interested in providing support. Because when you can see that you've had an impact on a target that has been listed, then it's kind of cool and you get excited about it and it's fun and you want to keep doing it, right? You feel like you're having a difference in this. And then the other part of it is that it has, over time, really provided some morale and psychological support to the Ukrainian people, but also the narrative surrounding this war, because there have been articles and journal articles published about the IT army and how it is having this impact on some Russian websites and that. So their technical effects may not be enduring because a DDoS attack is temporal by definition, right? You vector your assets towards it, and then when you stop applying that pressure to that system, then the effect is lost, right? But the psychological effect of having 200,000 people spread around the globe that are willing to kind of take up arms in cyberspace on behalf of the Ukrainians is a pretty powerful message and is something that I think really applies to this psychological element that Gene Sharp calls out. The third one is geographic and physical elements. And so one of the things that and of course I'm biased because I've been following this community for a long time, so I'm very much like excited about the IT Army and the work that they do. But when we think about conflict, we usually find it confined by geography. And what this war has really shown is that those geographic boundaries no longer apply. And so you get this digital diaspora that is really having an emotional attachment to this conflict that's unlike what we've been able to see in the past. And so the IT Army is this extension of this emotion, that outpouring, and it's a vector for people that are disconnected geographically from this conflict to have an impact or feel like they are contributing in a positive way on behalf of the Ukrainians. And the other part of the physical element and geography here is that this is different than a traditional resistance group, in the sense that traditional resistance group are working against an occupying power that are both located in the same geographic area. And here you're having a resistance group that's not located within Russia, having an impact within Russia. So it's essentially a disconnected in terms of geography and physical elements. The next attribute is timing. And what I love about this, the IT Army, is that they're very thoughtful about how they time and the timing and tempo of their attacks. So, for example, one of my favorite example, actually, I'll just flat out say it, is that they have weekend themes. And one of the weekend themes is that they went after and DDoS the Russian version of Grubhub. And in the United States, Grubhub are food delivery, right? So if you are even me and my little family, my husband and daughter, we order out on the weekends because we don't want to cook. And so if I don't have Grubhub and I don't have a food delivery service, like, that's annoying. And so it's this very like passive aggressive type way to get at, or imagine you're a college student and you can't order your food for Saturday night. Like, that's annoying. And so they're very thoughtful about the ways that they go about this. So their timing is important, and they also choose to target assets within the Russian government, so the state-provided services, on dates that are important. So when taxes are due, they go after the tax website. When university applications open, they have targeted the university application platform. So that, imagine if you're, an aspiring college student and you can't access the application window or app platform on the day that you're supposed to. That's frustrating. That has an impact, pretty psychological impact, if anything. And then the other aspect, the next one, number 5, is numbers and strength. As I've mentioned, the IT Army has had about 200K followers on this Telegram channel. Of course, that does not mean that all 200,000 are, DDoSing at the same time, because you have people in different time zones. You have, these volunteers are spread all throughout the globe. But it does mean that they've been able to sustain interest, at least. People aren't leaving the group in large droves. But they work, and they've figured out over time that listing out a lot of targets is not a way to get numbers and strength against a specific website, right? You need to have a small amount of targets so that you can put a lot of strength against those targets and actually have a longer and more enduring impact, or more significant impact. And so they've adjusted those tactics over time to understand how to vector the right amount of concentration of mass, if we want to use a military term, against a specific target so that it actually does have the intended effect. Number 6 is the issue of concentration and strength, which is, again, the same thing almost as numbers and strength. But when we talk about concentration, you don't need a lot of people. You need a lot of computing resources. And so what's fascinating, too, is that they've listed out in a separate Telegram channel, they have kind of this IT support, but they've listed out ways for people that are non-technical to understand better how they can leverage assets that they have within their home computing, kind of, their iPads, whatever, to be able to use and leverage that computing power on behalf of the IT Army. And then lastly, it's the initiative. And so, as I mentioned, they've been able to sustain about 200K followers over time. But they've also been able to, through the use of BDA, or providing battle damage assessments, keep people interested. And they also provide encouraging messages. I mean, it's great. You're there, they're like, this was fantastic, well done. And they provide a picture. And then, today we're going to go against, universities, because today is the day that the Ukrainians are celebrating their own students. And so we're going to try and make life hard. And I say this with a smile on my face because I do enjoy watching this community and watching it evolve. But this leads me to some of these conclusions that I want to talk about, because this could be a very different scenario where you imagine that you are on the receiving end of this disruptive activity. And it raises a lot of questions when we think about international law and what the state behavior should be and is supposed to be, or what we hope it to be, in and through cyberspace, and how state relationships in cyberspace are supposed to be executed. I think it also raises some questions about international humanitarian law, in particular, when we think about impacting civilians and the impact that war and conflict has on civilians and the civilian populations that aren't necessarily waging the war or even in support of the war that is going on. So over the last few days, a lot of the world has been very interested and fascinated by the reports of drone attacks on Moscow. But when you look at this and the IT army from a holistic perspective, like the Ukrainians have really been having an impact in Russia since the start of this war and the genesis of the Ukraine IT army, whether it's in a direct manner or a very passive kind of nonviolent manner. But they have been working to strike the heart of Russia since the beginning of this conflict. And so what's key to note about the IT army is that we are likely going to see manifestations like this in any future conflict. And so as nation states begin to consider and militaries begin to consider what future conflict and modern conflict looks like, it's these third-party actors that are having an indirect impact. It was mentioned yesterday, the Viasat hack, that at the opening of the conflict was intended to take out the Ukrainian military communications. And the thinking that, if that had actually been successful and those communications had remained down and we didn't have a tweet that then brought in Elon Musk and Starlink, it could have been a very different outcome in those first 3 days. And so the presence of Elon Musk on the battlefield, the presence of the IT army on the battlefield, raises questions about how third parties play a role in modern conflict. And specifically, another link to the IT army is this understanding that they use tools and they are using a commercial application, Telegram. They're using GitHub in order to house their tools and explain a lot of things that they're doing. And so we have commercial applications being used for purposes of conflict or for purposes of resistance. And so those types of questions have not entirely been fleshed out in both military circles, but also on the international, about what this means for state relationships, what this means for identifying who is an enemy combatant on the battlefield, but also what role do civilians play, and how do we factor in this third-party digital aspect where somebody could be on the other side of the globe but having an impact on a conflict that's happening within geographic boundaries. So with that, I'm going to close and turn it over to my fellow panelist, Bilyana, who is going to dive more into this notion of private companies on the battlefield and figuring that out. So thank you.
Thank you, Maggie.
So, no, please, Bilyana. Thank you so much, Maggie, for the build-up. Let me just give you all the introduction of Bilyana. Dr. Bilyana Lilly is a cybersecurity and information warfare professional. She is the chair of the Cyber Resilience Track at the Warsaw Security Forum and the leader of the forum's cyber group. She helps senior executives in the US government and in the private sector make strategic decisions while accounting for evolving cyber and geopolitical risk. Throughout her research paper, Business at War, the IT companies helping to defend Ukraine, Bilyana and her team has identified how private IT companies are providing pivotal effects, points to lessons learned and challenges identified so far in the ongoing fight against the invasion from Russia. So I'm really looking forward to hear more about it. Thank you so much, Bilyana.
Thank you, Raymond, and thank you, Maggie, for this fascinating presentation. And I really enjoy the description of the positive culture of the IT Army. I think we can learn a lot from it, and different companies can learn a lot from it. So I would like to shift focus slightly and focus on the foreign IT companies that have provided substantive assistance to Ukraine since the beginning of this latest stage of the war, which is February of 2022. And I'm going to present this research on behalf of a stellar team of experts who unfortunately couldn't join us here this year. These are Kenneth Giers, Robert Koch and Greg Ratry. Kenneth was the very first international representative to CCDCOE, and he's an American, and he was stationed in Estonia even before CyCon was established. Robert has been attending and speaking at almost every single CyCon so far, and Greg is, among many other things, the founder of CDAC, which is an organization that coordinates some of the IT assistance that's currently being provided to Ukraine. We decided to focus on this particular topic because the assistance that foreign companies have provided to Ukraine since last year has been unprecedented, and it has helped Ukraine stay online. And we've heard a lot of conversations about this already during this conference. But another reason why this topic is important is that it has accelerated a lot of very important discussions about what are the responsibilities of the private sector during wartime? What are the public-private partnerships that need to exist to ensure that the private sector continues to supply support to a victim of armed aggression? And what are the responsibilities of governments in this particular case? So we have a lot of discussions that are also happening on the sidelines of CyCon here on these topics. And when we started our research, we had 3 objectives. First, we wanted to identify the companies that have provided assistance to Ukraine, and we wanted to create a categorization of how exactly we can group the different assistance that has been provided. Second, we wanted to discuss what are the risks and benefits that companies face when they offer assistance during conflict, based on the experience that we have, that companies have over the past year and a half. And finally, we wanted to see, okay, now that we know all of this information, what are some actionable policy recommendations that we can propose to improve the provision and coordination of assistance going forward to Ukraine, but also what are the legal frameworks or the policies that we can start discussing now so that in the future, in the event of another conflict, we as an international community, as NATO, as nation states, are better prepared to actually answer such an aggression like the aggression from Russia. So with that in mind, and I'm only briefly going to talk about those 3 points. We have a lot more in the paper. We also have a table where we summarize the contributions of different companies. So if I miss someone, it is not intentional. It's because I just have 15 minutes and I want to be respectful of my fellow panelists here and also give a chance to Lars to talk about his paper. So when we talked about companies, we only included the contributions of companies that have publicly disclosed them, and we also included contributions that haven't been classified or are not sensitive or have been restricted under NDAs, which is non-disclosure agreements. So we classified the contributions into 3 categories: hardware, software, and cyber services. Very simple. With regards to hardware, the Ukrainian government, especially in the beginning of the conflict, used very unorthodox methods to contact some of the companies that eventually provided assistance and are continuing to provide assistance. For example, before the invasion in February 2022, the Ukrainian government had its data stored exclusively on servers located on the premises of governments, physically located on the premises of government buildings in Ukraine. This means that those servers were vulnerable to missile attacks from Russia. And the Ukrainian government knew that, so they quickly changed the laws in order to be able to transfer that data that they had and was vulnerable to attacks and could have paralyzed the activities of the government to servers and data centers that are dispersed all over Europe. And very quickly, AWS responded to a public call for help from the Ukrainian government, and in one meeting, a senior AWS representative, Amazon representative, met with the Ukrainian ambassador in Ukraine's embassy in London, and they drafted the most critical or essential data of 27 Ukrainian ministries, 18 universities, and some of the major Ukrainian private sector entities, including the largest Ukrainian bank, Privatbank. So for anyone who's worked in cybersecurity, the speed with which this was conducted is absolutely impressive. 3 days later, AWS Snowballs, which are mobile data transfer devices, were already in Kiev and the data transfer commenced. And in the first 4 months of the war, more than 10 petabytes of data was exported through those devices, through the cloud, to data centers in Europe. This is unprecedented speed. And the whole process wasn't necessarily perfect. We actually discussed that recently in a meeting, but it was largely considered a success. and it helped Ukraine significantly build resilience against cyber attacks and against actual physical attacks, because data servers in Europe are invulnerable to Russia's missiles. Not yet, or at least the risk is a lot lower than if they were located in Ukraine. Let's leave it at that. Another company that joined the fight in a very unorthodox way was Starlink, and Maggie, thank you for bringing that up. On the first day of the invasion, we had the Viasat hack. And then Ukraine's vice prime minister sent a tweet to Elon Musk appealing for help, and Elon Musk immediately authorized use of Starlink in Ukraine. I'll talk about this case a little later because it's problematic in other ways as well. But Starlink has become essential to the Ukrainian government to conduct some of its command and control communication. For example, President Zelensky uses Starlink to communicate with allied commanders and to conduct some of his communication with others as well. There are more than 150,000 Ukrainians that are using Starlink today. So moving on to software. In addition to Amazon Cloud, Microsoft Cloud is also widely used in Ukraine, and it's helping the Ukrainian government, healthcare, education services to continue to function without disruption. So this has been a very important and successful contribution from the private sector to Ukraine and to its ability to withstand Russia's onslaught in cyberspace. In addition to that, especially in the beginning of the war, there were companies that provided essential anti-DDoS tools, because everyone who follows the war knows that in the beginning there were a lot of disruptive and destructive attacks from the Russian government, including a wave of DDoS attacks against critical infrastructure in Ukraine. And companies like Cloudflare, like Google, provided substantial assistance by giving their anti-DDoS tools for free to help Ukraine in that period. ESET, Sophos are other companies that have provided very important essential software solutions to Ukraine. Moving on to the third category, cyber services. We have again Microsoft pitching in even before the actual invasion in February of last year. Microsoft identified 6 APTs and 8 malware families that were already conducting reconnaissance and prepositioning malware on the networks of over 50 Ukrainian organizations. That is before the invasion in February. In January, Microsoft also identified a very significant wiper malware campaign and immediately alerted the Ukrainian government. And since then, Microsoft set up a 24/7 encrypted communication with Ukrainian defense forces, cyber defense forces, and has been passing on timely cyber threat intelligence ever since up to this day. Other companies that have been providing essential services include Google, Mandiant as well. Mandiant has been conducting threat hunting, incident response, as well as cyber threat intelligence and helping with the visibility of Ukraine's networks and providing essential telemetry and analysis of cyber threat actors and vulnerabilities. We also have Recorded Future, Cisco Talos, and others. And as I mentioned, we have a more comprehensive list in our paper. I encourage you all to open the SciCon book and actually read it if you're interested in the topic. A lot of the companies chose to send their assistance to Ukraine directly. They communicated directly with different agencies in the Ukrainian government that required that assistance. But some companies decided to go through CDAC. And CDAC is the organization that I mentioned. One of my co-authors founded it in March of last year. CDAC coordinates the assistance from about 15 to 20 members. And although Greg, the founder, couldn't be here, the COO of CDAC is here. His name is Tim, and I don't know if he's in the room. Tim, are you here? Yes, this is Tim. So if anyone is interested in helping CDAC or getting involved, Tim, sorry to put you on the spot, but I hope you get some people come and talk to you after this. So last year, CDAC assessed that it communicated with over 15 Ukrainian agencies, and it answered requests managed to satisfy about 50 requests from these agencies. And the value of the contributions that it coordinated was about $10 million. Organizations that are members include Microsoft, Mandiant, Recorded Future, the Cyber Threat Alliance, and others. And CDAC is expanding, and if there's any company in the room or representative from a company that is not a member, I strongly encourage you to talk to Tim about how you can help. As I mentioned in the beginning, after we identified the companies and the products and services they've offered, we also wanted to understand, okay, these companies assisted a government at war. What are the risks that they faced? And what are the benefits that they actually incurred because of their presence in the condition in a war zone? So with regards to risks, there are some traditional risks for a company that conducts operations in a foreign country or in a foreign territory. And those include language barrier, compatibility, cost, distance. But all of these operational considerations are amplified in a time of war. In addition to that, companies face other issues. Intellectual property theft is a higher risk under these conditions. Companies also, the communications of companies are subject to eavesdropping from multiple nation-state threat actors. The confidentiality, integrity, availability of communications can also be compromised at any time. Another very significant risk that companies face is that because of their direct involvement, they could be considered as direct participants in the war and could be considered as legitimate targets from the Russian government or any other stakeholder that's actively involved in the conflict, which can pose physical, reputational threats and to the company's assets and to actual employees. And we had last year in October, the Russian government announcing that any commercial satellite, which Starlink is, for example, would be considered a part of the conflict and could be a legitimate target for the Russian government. And the US government immediately responded saying that any attack against US critical infrastructure and commercial satellites could be that, will be responded to, or there will be a response from the US government. The whole idea of Starlink's involvement also illustrates another risk, but not so much for the company as for the government, specifically for the government of Ukraine, which has become overly reliant on the provision of Starlink without any guarantee for the continuation of the provision of that service. Last year in October, Elon Musk made another announcement where he stated that SpaceX will not be able to indefinitely sponsor the provision of Starlink to Ukraine. This immediately triggered a response from the Ukrainian government, which was that Starlink has become a part of Ukraine's critical infrastructure, and removing or withdrawing Starlink from the battlefield right now will have a significant impact on the Ukraine's ability to conduct its operations and on the war effort. So as a result, there was a back and forth between who's going to pay and what's going to happen. And then Elon Musk announced that Starlink, he will continue the provision of Starlink to Ukraine. But that episode still illustrates the harsh reality, or the reality, which is that there's no legally binding clause that obligates a company to continue to provide services to Ukraine if this hasn't been a contractual obligation. So this is an actual risk that I think in future conflicts, companies and countries may be wise to address. So these are some of the risks. What about the benefits? Well, any company that's defending a victim of unprovoked aggression or an armed attack could receive a reputational gain from the fact that they're helping a victim from like-minded states. Another huge benefit from companies is that they're actually stress testing their software, hardware, and cyber services in war conditions. So this improves the quality of their products, or at least the perception that their products have been stress tested in war, and this could help with future clients, future contracts, and so on. Another benefit for companies is that through the telemetry that they're collecting on the ground, for the visibility that they have of Ukraine's networks, they have timely information about tactics, techniques, and procedures of cyber threat actors, new vulnerabilities, malware that's being used, and they can use that to improve their products and services for clients not only in Ukraine, but also outside of Ukraine. So these are some of the benefits that we're seeing. With regards to how can we improve the processes that we currently have in place? How can we improve the provision and the coordination of assistance to Ukraine at the moment? Well, we proposed 4 actionable recommendations, and I very much would love to hear your feedback on this. We already discussed, Martin, I'm going to put you on the spot. We already discussed one of them with Martin just before the presentation. One is to consider creating something like an Article 5 for the private sector. Article 5 of NATO's treaty dictates that's the Musketeer clause that says that an attack against one is an attack against all. So the private sector, in order to guarantee provision of assistance to a country that's under duress, that's under attack, could consider signing such a clause to create some transparency and to create clarity with respect to expectations and responsibilities that a company may have. And Nico, I would also love to hear your perspective. I see you thinking. But something that Martin suggested actually is to perhaps, and I like the idea, Martin, so I will say that I kind of agree with that. Perhaps this could be a clause in contracts between companies and nations instead of being at a NATO level type of obligation. But it's something to consider basically to clarify expectations and responsibilities. Another proposal that we have was, we've already discussed this in many meetings here, is to clarify the responsibilities and the behaviors, or in general, the rules of engagement for IT companies in conflict. We have international humanitarian law, but international humanitarian law, or IHL, focuses primarily on nation states and organized armed groups, and it doesn't cover the private sector. So having guidelines about the limitations or the limits of the behavior, or expectations of behavior of the private sector in war zones, the responsibilities, perhaps even clauses about protection that they can enjoy could be helpful going forward. And I would love to hear what our legal friends think about that particular issue later in our Q&A. Another idea that we had was to create multi-stakeholder incident response plans at the level of governments. You're probably familiar with the incident response plans that typically, ideally, organizations of any level of maturity should have. Those are basically plans where organizations in advance think about the types of breaches and cyber incidents that they may face, and they list the step-by-step processes that they will follow in the event of a breach. So those incident response plans could be expanded to include scenarios of actual wars. And they can list the type of tools and services that the governments will need to withstand an onslaught in cyberspace from a nation state. They can also include, the particular plans can also include the stakeholders, the companies that can provide the particular services and tools required, and the points of contact for these services. And our final policy proposal is to consider using a common point of contact or coordinating bodies such as CDAC to streamline and facilitate the provision of assistance to Ukraine. And a final point, and I sit down after this, is we strongly encourage companies not only to look at how to provide and continue to provide assistance to Ukraine to help it defend itself from Russia, but also to help Ukraine with reconstruction efforts, which Ukraine already has started in some of the territories that they have freed from Russia. So thank you so much for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Bilyana, for posting some interesting questions, and I hope we will be able to address some of them in the Q&A. Dr. Lars Gjesvik is a senior researcher in the research group for security and defense at the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs, where he also serves as the co-leader of the Research Center for Digitalization and Cybersecurity. His research focuses on the intersection of private enterprise and state interests, security challenges, and power politics related to digitalization and emergent technologies. Lars recently obtained his doctorate from the University of Oslo, where he studied the interaction between private companies and state interests in the digital space and the role of technology companies in shaping international conflicts, making me the only one on stage without a doctorate. So congratulations. His paper focuses on digital supply chain dependency and resilience, looking at the importance of mapping digital supply chains to build state resilience. I hope you will share with us what you found, and in particular, if states pay sufficient attention to the resilience of their digital infrastructure. So please, Lars.
Thank you, Raymond, for the introduction. Like the other presenters, I don't have a PowerPoint today. It's in fact something we agreed on beforehand. So if anyone in the audience requires fancy pictures to pay attention, blame is shared among all of us, I'm afraid. The paper I will be presenting today is the collective work of a bigger group of researchers, but I'm the only one who was able to attend today. I cannot necessarily do justice to the skills and expertise of the people I have worked with. And some of my co-authors have a lot of expertise I don't. So there are two main consequences of this. To avoid going out of my depth, I will try to stick to what I know and what I participated most in writing. And secondly, there might be a few questions I'm unable to answer. I am, however, very open and happy to put anyone interested in touch with my co-authors if there are any questions. That is beyond my skills. That being said, this paper is, if not the culmination, then at least one of the offshoots of a 4-year project I've been a part of, looking into how dependence on transnational digital networks affects states' autonomy, security, and sovereignty. This issue of how states' authority and ability to control and provide national security is challenged by modern society's dependence on digital networks has become an increasingly hot and salient topic in international politics. With this conference being held in Europe, with a significant attendance of US academics and practitioners, it's hard not to think of one of the most widely known and debated flashpoints of this issue, which is the contest over US and EU data transfers and privacy, which, with Meta's recently record fine by the Irish Data Protection Agency, is once again prominently in the news. So this question of autonomy and sovereignty in digital technology, as it is often framed exactly like this issue, around privacy and data protection, which is undoubtedly important. Yet, the basic contention of our paper is that it has somewhat overshadowed other aspects and equally important questions of states' dependence on digital networks. If the well-known triad of information security being about confidentiality, integrity, and availability holds true, then maybe we have paid too much attention to the first 2 points of that triad and not enough on availability. Similarly, when we think of cybersecurity, the attention is most commonly drawn towards intelligence operations, the looting sprees of ransomware crews, or the ever-looming specter of so-called cyber war. What is not so commonly addressed and discussed are broader structural issues of infrastructures and dependencies, how national and cybersecurity is shaped not only by extraordinary events, but more than anything by the ordinary business as usual. Now, if you in the audience agrees with this, and you are of course very welcome to disagree, we should spend some time thinking about how questions of digital sovereignty, autonomy, and security play out in relation to the everyday business as usual availability of key services. That is, and I think my co-panelists have done a great job so far of making a better case than I could ever do, in times of crisis and war, the most important question becomes how to ensure that digital services and products continue to function as intended. The war in Ukraine has been a stark reminder of how important access to digital technologies are and will continue to be in modern conflict. Now, recognizing this will draw our attention to a simple fact. For most states, the infrastructures, service, and various parts of the software ecosystem that they rely on is not necessarily provided within their borders by domestic companies. Rather, for most states, it is their continued connection to broader global digital networks that allows their everyday digital technologies to work seamlessly. This does not mean that nobody thinks about the resilience and security of these networks. A lot of very competent and way more knowledgeable people than myself is thinking quite a bit about this. But for the states who are concerned about the national security of their digital technologies, they might want to also start thinking about this a little bit more themselves. While digital companies know a great deal about resilience, their ideas might not always align with those of governments. And for states to leave the issue of resilience and redundancy to private companies is, at a minimum, stripping them of the agency to ensure their own national security. Now, let me continue by giving a little bit of context. Now, there is a broader shift underway in how states relate to and understand global supply chains and economic networks. In part, this has been driven by the increasing use and manipulation of these global structures for coercive and subversive purposes. Again, the ongoing war in Ukraine is an illustrative example. The Western sanctions against Russia acts as the tip of the iceberg that is growing use of economic statecraft worldwide. But it is also shaped by the recognition that these global networks are fragile. Also fragile also in the face of unforeseen events and disasters like a global pandemic that stops global trade and shuts down borders with short notice. The sum of these trends is what appears to be a restructuring of the world economy, where security, resilience, and robustness is given more weight, while economic efficiency is given less. Again, turning toward the topic of this conference of digital technologies and cybersecurity, the evolution and debates about digital sovereignty fits nicely within this picture. Similar to many of the most commonly used and essential products and services that we rely on, digital technologies are underpinned by a complex, fragmented, but at times consolidated network that is dispersed across the globe. And similarly to many other global supply chains and networks, where states are situated within these networks and their connectivity to them matters for their security and ability to ensure uninterrupted business as usual. So take debates about data localization, for instance, requiring that sensitive data be stored within territorial boundaries. This has been mainly revolving around preventing access by foreign intelligence and having control over information. It is more than anything a question of confidentiality. For our paper, in here I start to venture into the parts of the paper I know less about. We wanted to think of digital sovereignty from a perspective of ensuring that digital technologies continue to work and the supply chains and networks that underpin them. The question we asked was fairly simple. How do we go about mapping dependencies that ensure that software and applications are available and function also in times of crisis? Now, this is a big question, and we will be the first to admit that our approach has both its limitation and its challenges. I would prefer if you thought about our paper more as an initiator of a broader conversation than a definitive mapping or any conclusive findings that you can take and use as they are. But in the terms I understood the technical aspects of our work, our approach was fairly simple. Using a set of novel tracing methodologies to geolocate the various dependencies a set of common apps drew on during normal everyday use. So we started by resetting a phone to its factory settings and installing the apps we wanted to test one by one. We then used the novel geotracing methodologies developed by a similar research lab and measured where the resources apps drew on to function were physically located, as well as the corporate entity that owned and controlled the associated service and infrastructures. It is a simple set of measurements, stating nothing more than when you use application X, it draws on resources located in location Y that are owned and operated by corporate entity Z. Measuring where all of these resources are located and the routes they take going there provide a map of geographic dependencies, where the resources needed for apps to work actually are. Mapping the corporate entities that own and control the infrastructure to travel to highlight another set of dependencies with different prospects for exploitation and different risks attached. Together, they paint a partial picture of how cities and states are central or peripheral in terms of key resources and the resilience of the networks they rely on. Then, using VPN services and replicating the measurements in different locations and with different apps, we repeated the process, allowing us to compare how these dependencies looked in different locations. It is a very simple way of starting to answer the question, what are states' dependencies to ensure continued availability in times of crisis? Our study has a limited scope in this, measuring only a few locations of Oslo, Zagreb, Dublin, Paris, Barcelona, and Mexico City. So it is tilted toward Europe, which is more due to technical limitations than any inherent methodological design. Now, our findings are in some ways intuitive and what you would expect. When it comes to where key resources are located, bigger cities and bigger states have more extensive infrastructure, so that Paris, for example, mainly draw on resources located in France, while Oslo and Zagreb are relying a lot on neighboring countries or countries that are even further away. The exception to this rule of size, which is Dublin, is well known as a global hosting center for data centers. When it comes to the corporate players, again, the largest cities have a greater diversity than the smaller cities. Outliers like Oslo and Zagreb, in some instances, rely on a single or two key providers for all its digital connectivity. Simply put, attracting the investments of global corporations in digital infrastructures offers one way of having more resiliency and security. Now, building on this, the more interesting question is what this means for how we think about digital sovereignty, security, and autonomy. From one perspective, the presence of large, mainly US corporations has been seen as a problematic security issue, yet from our perspective, attracting investments in infrastructure is also beneficial for national security. That is not to say that dependence on foreign providers is unproblematic, but rather that it's more complex and a complicated issue how states should negotiate and address their digital dependencies. It can at times be a significant boon for a state's capacities and resilience and robustness to mobilize organizations and personnel beyond national borders. It can also be a boon in times of crisis by ensuring that you have the infrastructure and services needed closer to home. On the other hand, doing so entrenches any dependency you might have on corporate actors, making it even harder to change your dependencies in the future and making you even more reliant on foreign providers. Now, as more and more states are starting to rethink their digital dependencies and their economic dependencies writ large, digital dependencies is a particularly thorny problem precisely because different conceptualizations and ideas of sovereignty and security are at odds with one another. So policies to address one part of this undermines another. I'm leaving the in-depth analysis of our findings for those interested in the paper, and I encourage you to actually read it. We also, as I said, this is the start of our process of mapping, so hopefully we will be able to do more work on this in the future. But by going more in depth, I'm fearful I would miss out on some key details that I'm not aware of, and I also think it would risk misrepresenting our findings by making them seem more conclusive than they actually are. But overall, I would like to close with restating the main goal of our research, which is to think of digital dependencies and sovereignty not only through the lens of securing information and confidentiality, but more from a prism of ensuring robust and resilient services. We think it's key for states to start considering this to a greater extent and start thinking more seriously about it. We think it's particularly key for smaller states in smaller economies who might be more peripheral and vulnerable than they like to think.
Thank you so much, Lars. And I think your last point there pivots really well back to what we heard yesterday about not necessarily only thinking of how do we protect our data, but how do we also ensure connectivity, that we have access to it in time of conflict. So thank you so much. I see the time has kind of passed. I do have some questions prepared. We have discussed them previously, but seeing that we're so many people in the room, I would like to open the stage for question from the audience. Straight up, I see hands. Let's maybe we can have one each, please, on the front there, row 3.
Thank you. I'm Vlad. I'm with Ukrainian SSCIP. I would like to address the research that was demonstrated yesterday and today by Grace and Maggie, and what's been said through the sessions of this conference about the threshold of armed conflict and escalation and all this kind of stuff. So could you please, and I couldn't find the better panel to ask this question, Ed, so could you please imagine an alternative timeline starting from February last year, and where everything that happened in cyberspace still happened, but the full-scale invasion never been started. In your opinion, intuitively, would everything that happened on both sides, with all parties involved in cyberspace exclusively, trespass the threshold of armed conflict? Thank you.
Okay, the
question.
threshold of armed conflict and an attack in cyberspace. Please.
So I'm not a lawyer, Vlad, but it's a great question. And we discussed a little bit that topic yesterday in a session that was under the Chatham House rule. So I cannot say who stated something, but I can at least talk about the ideas that we discussed. And it seemed to have become clear in the room that there needed to be a physical attack or an attack that we can observe for this to become an armed conflict. Otherwise, we could say that the January wiper malware attack that was discovered in January could have been the initiation of a conflict, but we all reacted in February when the tanks finally rolled through the border. So I think despite the fact that international law is changing and we are considering cyber to be a domain of warfare, I still think for NATO to get involved, for countries to start noticing, meeting the threshold in cyberspace, although we on paper say that it's possible, I am yet to see that in a case, and I think it will be harder for nations to get involved unless there's a physical attack.
Would you like to?
I do have an idea. So there are a wide number of groups. I took it from the Ukrainian perspective, but we easily could have been sitting in Russia and been talking about Killnet, who really changed their tactics. Killnet is a disruptive group of pro-Russian. They call themselves hackers, but they're DDoS people, and the original group provided a DDoS tool as a service and something for purchase. But then when the conflict kicked off, they transitioned to doing DDoS against any country that expressed support for Ukraine, right? They've been disruptive at best. And so I think regardless of whether this conflict kicked off, there is a scenario where you could imagine that pro-Ukrainian people would band together to cause disruption, because we aren't in an armed conflict, but we see disruption happening all the time with criminal groups and kind of anonymous does stuff. And so it's the type of activity that raises questions about what norms should be like in cyberspace. But because it is an ongoing armed conflict, that's the reason that I think people have been relatively supportive of the Ukraine IT Army and kind of their goals and initiatives, if that makes sense.
Building on that, I want to refer back to what you said during your presentation, Bilyana, and you talked about Starlink and the Russian announcement, which I think came in the scene of the open-ended working group with the UN on Starlink satellites being a potential lawful target, and then the US response. In my mind, it illustrates the potential spillover effect of a conflict by actions taken by IT companies. And in your research, looking at that, are companies cognizant of that risk? And what measures do you see we could take in order to mitigate those risks?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think there were a lot of potential risks and scenarios, including this one, that I don't think companies really had time to discuss and address. And we've been talking about those issues here at SciCon, and I think we will be talking about them for years to come. So I think they're cognizant that this is an issue, but I don't think anyone has a roadmap on how they're going to act if this happens at this stage.
Okay. On the left hand there, ICRC.
Thank you, Raymond. Yes, my name is Kuba Machak. I work for the International Committee of the Red Cross as a legal advisor. But I mean, what I'm going to offer is in my personal capacity. Very fascinating panel. Thank you very much. I mean, I listened very carefully, especially to the perspectives on international humanitarian law, something that indeed I spent quite a lot of time thinking about. And so I think it's great that there is the baseline agreement that international humanitarian law applies to these situations. I would add two quick reflections. The second one is a question. So one reflection, one question. So Bilyana, when you mention that IHL is addressed mainly to states and organized armed groups, of course, I agree. That's if you read the rules in the Geneva Conventions, that's most of them are phrased in those ways. But we shouldn't forget that even though they don't address themselves directly to companies, as you rightly say, the criminalized rules of IHL, there is no doubt, apply to individuals. So every rule of IHL that prohibits, for example, direct attacks against civilians, direct attacks against civilian objects that are criminalized, there is no other way of bringing individuals before international tribunals, and we have seen that happen around the world, other than because they are bound by these criminalized rules of IHL. And so individuals, as they might be members of companies, or even as Maggie was talking about, members of hacking collectives, remain bound by these rules. So we welcome the need to clarify the rules, but some things are clear. So some of these aspects we know. And then my question for the panel would be about this trend that I think all three of you described. We call it the trend of civilianization of digital operations, civilianization of cyber activities. So, in the past, one would say that the lines were clearer between what the militaries are doing and what civilians are doing. And so again, international humanitarian law is based on a fundamental principle, the principle of distinction that underlies all of the rules of IHL. And so every involvement of civilians, whether it's of private sector, whether it's of individual hackers, brings these two categories closer together. And so it poses a problem for the interpretation of the rules. So my question for you would be, what should states do, what should other stakeholders do to reverse this trend, as much as it is problematic from the perspective of interpretation and upholding these fundamental values that, as I have said in the beginning, we all agree should apply also in this novel space. Thank you.
Maggie?
I think it's important to recognize that civilians have always played a role in conflict, no matter where, especially when you consider a smaller state being attacked by an aggressive state. I think back to the American Revolution, like families were on the front lines because the wives went and supported their spouses that were fighting. Civilians have always been there. And so this is definitely a different type of manifestation. And of the trend that when your country is attacked, it's a whole of nation effort to repel the aggressor. And there's been some argument. Kurt Sanger is in the audience as well. He's a lawyer and wrote a great piece with Peter Pascucci, another lawyer, that discusses kind of Ukraine IT army and the norms within cyberspace. And I think one of the interesting facets of that paper is looking at participation and what it means to be an active participant, because that matters to the International Red Cross and international humanitarian law. But another emphasis in that piece is just that Ukraine is leveraging unconventional assets in its resistance to a much larger state being aggressive and invading. And so from the perspective, we took in our paper the perspective of Thomas Rid. Again, I mentioned this, but that offensive cyberspace operations are not violent in the terms that we consider kinetic operations violent. And so I do think that it's going to be a difficult conversation to come to agreement of when something that happens in and through cyberspace actually ends up being violent. Protest, resistance movements have all existed in the digital space. We've seen patriotic hacking happen. And so I think what we're seeing with the IT army is a much more coordinated and purposeful patriotic hacking on behalf of a cause, an idea, and the country of Ukraine. And Yeah, I agree with you that there's a lot of nuance there, but coming from a military background and understanding what it means for me to be involved in executing an offensive cyberspace operation and the wickets that we go through and all of that, and when we consider it a Title 10 under U.S. Code action versus something that's happening external to us, is different. What I think is fascinating about modern conflict, and something that you point out, is that the third-party actors are the ones that are really shaping what the information dimension looks like and how that happens. There was a great panel yesterday on international law, and Lindsay is also in the audience, brought up this notion that there's digital reasons that we can prosecute, and there's digital evidence that we can gather. And so I think moving forward, this is going to be the big question of how states actually understand entities like the IT Army and their role in participation. But civilians have always been on the battlefield, I guess is my point, and figuring out how we extend that to the digital battlefield, I think, is a really fascinating area that we need more investigation. Obviously, I can talk about that forever, so I'll stop.
Lars, please.
Yeah, I think that's an incredibly difficult and important question. So I have no good answers. But first of all, I think it's the closing of the border or the raising of the border that you mentioned is quite obvious. And I think it's as long as private companies are at the forefront of technological development and roll out and hold these key resources, I think it's hard to roll that back. I think one thing, like Bilyana was mentioning, and also some with the IT Army of Ukraine, some form of opting in mechanism might be useful to have. Like you talked about how private companies can actually take a stance and make a decision, not being dragged in without their will. I think you mentioned you were from the Red Cross. I think you've been working on the opposite mechanism, right, of opting out, of having these digital markers of humanitarian agencies to mark that we are, we're civilians, we're a non-party in this conflict. I think mechanisms of opting in and opting out might be one way to have better mechanisms is one avenue to explore. But I also think the ambiguity is just too useful for it to be a hard distinction that is ever coming back.
I agree. I know that there were other questions, but
Okay, perfect. No. Yes, I think on row 4 yep, yes, please. There's the mic coming behind you there.
Matthias Krempel from Germany. Probably my question is a little bit easier. When I listen to you, at the generic level, I understand that you talk about a world which you do not completely understand. We all don't, because the world in systematic ways is a system of systems, or functional systems, which are interlinked in a sometimes non-linear way. Having said that, the question is, would you think that we would need to do anyway some kind of a mapping? Back in the 18th century, we started with maps of the physical world, well, having white spots, which we covered in the late 19th century. But the maps were useful anyway. This can be done in a digitized world as well, and I speak from an experience where I worked for the largest system we have, and that's a global air traffic management system. And we underwent the painful task of applying architectural frameworks to approach the idea of mapping it, including all the dimensions, processes, physical assets, interlinks. So the concluding question is, who would trust oneself to start probably approaching that as something where we cannot do it completely in a satisfactory way? Or do you say, forget about it, we have to live with just exploring islands for the next 20 years?
Okay, thank you. And Lars, I'm going to go to you, but I remember we talked about this mapping, and I also want to add on, if possible, to map. Is it the same opportunities for the big states, the rich and powerful, or is it also for the smaller ones? Yesterday, we heard from the Australian Major General, their multiple billion-dollar investment in order to meet the challenges of emergent and disruptive technologies. So please.
First of all, also always great to get the cop out of being able to say, I don't know. But I think, mapping is an important first step. I think what to map is a crucial question. I think there's no coincidence that you're seeing a lot of European Union, United States starting to look at supply chain dependencies, not just for digital technologies, but for all economic dependencies. It's very much on the agenda, I think, across the globe for a reason. Like you say, it gives us a partial picture, but it's a place to start, and it's a place to maybe start seeing the key choke points and the key vulnerabilities. But it will only take us so far. But I think, like you mentioned, white spots on the map. I think closing those off is going to be is going to be important, and I think it's going to be a priority in the years to come.
So from the perspective of cybersecurity advisory, putting my CISSP hat, we could start from, I think, creating an inventory of data could be time-consuming and very expensive based on the level of the maturity of the organization, size, and all of that. But what could be important to do, and also data moves all the time, data in transit, data in rest, like conducting regular mappings can also take a lot of time and resources. But understanding what are the critical functions of the organization and then mapping the data that needs to, you have to know where the data is that needs to be secured for the critical functions of the organization to not be disrupted. I would say that's essential for any organization and for any government.
I would say yes and no. From a military perspective, no, I don't want that out there. And I think I think there's a lot of benefit. But again, like if you look internally, then it's very important so that you know where your key assets are and what the no-fail situations are. But I think when you consider mapping, I mean, to me, it's still kind of ludicrous that Google Maps can have, if I put it on satellite mode, that I can still see some of our most sensitive areas. And you're like, why? But then you see the little ball going around on top of the cards and you're like, okay. But so I think there's, states are going to wrestle with that security versus transparency type question that gets raised every time that something of national security becomes evident. It's important to know internally where your fault lines are, but when we think about the ways and how easy it is to get information on an adversary, that if I have a map, then of course everybody's going to want that map. And it would be very hard to secure that map for internal eyes only, if that makes sense.
Okay. Fourth row on the left. Yes?
Just a question. My name is Ben Valk. I'm working at the CCD law branch, and I've been deputy legal advisor at the International Military Staff of the NATO HQ in Brussels. And I'm kind of fascinated by the Article 5 thing. Experience in practice how difficult it is to, at least Article 5 is a consensus-based decision. So it's all nations to reach consensus on whether they are not invoking Article 5. And I'm curious how you will think that such a thing would work with commercial companies. Would that be a consensus-based decision, and would it be kind of, how would you define the limits? Second question would be on the ROEs. You said kind of standing of ROEs. If there is a mission, if there is a NATO mission, it would always be tailor-made ROEs for a mission. How would you think that would work for companies if you talk about ROEs? Because there would be an incident, then you have to respond. Would you then create, if you would?
Can you please repeat the second part? Because I was writing the first
part. Oh, sorry, yeah. Now, the second part is on the rules of engagement, the ROEs. Like in NATO, in a NATO mission, it's always based on a mission and it's tailor-made. I'm curious how you would see that for your Article 5 construction and maybe having ROEs for, if you want to name them ROEs for private companies. Maybe you used to think of another name, but
That's such a great question, and I'm so glad that you didn't dismiss it offhand. So first, on the consensus-based decision, I don't think we can expect from companies to act like governments. NATO is a consensus-based decision. It consists of governments, not of private sector entities. So I think the idea would be in the realistic scenario. So ideally, yes, if there is a consensus and the consensus is yes, there is a victim of armed aggression, we should all help. Ideally, yes, I would love to see this. I don't think in practice, though, we can make companies agree to something like that. So I would say that in the spirit of Article 5, when a company signs this Article 5 for the IT sector, it will be a pledge to help. And then there will be room for maneuver and independent decision-making from the company, because also companies are responsible to their boards, not to their constituents, and they don't have the obligation to protect the population. They're not governments. They operate based on very different mandates. So I think already asking them to sign something is something like a pledge commitment to help is already a lot to ask from the private sector. I don't think we can change them to that extent, which I think is perhaps a positive thing. Rules of engagement, perhaps that would be dependent on every company itself, and perhaps I would position those mostly within the multi-stakeholder incident response plans that I think every government should have, because I think it will also be dependent on the government that's under attack.
I know there was a question in the back. Yep. Second from the back, I think. On the right. Yep.
Thank you very much for the very interesting presentation. Antoine Landry from NATO ACT in Norfolk. And we've got a session tomorrow on CivMil. I'm trying to kind of promote it. And in fact, all the three papers are very much related to what we want to discuss tomorrow. One reflection on the resilience. This is a topic that we are very much focusing on right now as we speak in ACT. And we try to look at it from the mission perspective. So it means, and maybe you have the answer, we don't at this stage, the mapping would be very much mission-specific, task-related mission task and decomposition. So it means there is no like a standalone mapping that you can do. You have really a need to keep refreshing your model to make sure that it's really up to date and relevant to the mission that the commander will conduct. So to us, this is really a challenge to create this model and to keep it updated. So happy to have your thought on that. And the other one, it's building on Ben's remarks. So we talk about rules of engagement, Article 5, etc. To me, it's quite different than what companies are used to doing. So my question, especially to you, have you basically come across any hints that company might be looking for new skill set, because for this they would need probably like lawyers and legal advisors. This is a completely different skill set. We are maybe not looking after cybersecurity professional, but another type of expertise that would be required for companies if this trend of companies being at the front line of conflicts amplified as we move forward. So yeah, basically one reflection and one question, especially on the skill set that would be required for companies to be at the front line in cyber. Thank you.
Thank you for the perspective from ACT. Would you care to comment?
It's a great question about the skill set. I think those will be legal departments, and I know we have Microsoft representatives here, and I have to say I don't work for Microsoft, but the reason why I decided to write this whole paper is because of Microsoft's behavior in Ukraine. Because to me it was absolutely unexpected that they will so overtly support a government at war, given the risks that they are incurring. So the skill set would be with legal departments, and I would say at this point, if we're talking about policies and understanding how to communicate with a government, how to communicate with NATO and other countries and companies that are involved, and understand the geopolitical risk that a company incurs when they're on the front lines, I think that's what's required. Also understanding international humanitarian law and so on. And I think there we'll perhaps see involvement from multiple stakeholders, and some will be more prepared than others. I think companies that actually have the resources to dedicate to such a unit are companies like Microsoft, like Google, like Amazon. But smaller companies like ESET, Cloudflare, Recorded Future, perhaps would act more on on altruism and personal conviction than on calculations and skill sets and an actual framework that's created by educated professionals.
Yeah, just a quick comment on the perspective. I wasn't involved in the mapping. That's part of the project where I was kind of detached. I will say it took a lot longer than any of us expected, and it changed a lot. I think it was a source of great frustration for our team. So I understand your pain. I'm more than happy to put you in touch with the lead scientist who was responsible for that mapping. I think he might have some very interesting lessons. And all I can say is good luck. It's hell.
I am super happy to see that there's more questions. Unfortunately, we are out of time. And I will like to say thank you so much to our three panelists. Thank you for your research. I highly recommend you opening up the book from SciCon, reading their articles. And for those that still have questions that you haven't gotten your answers to, I'm sure you could grab a hold of them in the hallway and during our coffee break, which I think is for 30 minutes from now on. But please, before we leave, let's give them all a big round of applause. Thank you so much.